You guys are all here for John Okada, the Life and Rediscovered Work of the author of NoNo Boy. And so with us today, we have Frank Abe, Greg Robinson, who are the editors, and Brian Niiya to moderate. And so I will bring Brian up shortly, but Brian is the content director of densho.org, an organization whose mission is to preserve the testimonies of Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated in World War II. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Brian.
Yeah, thank you, and yeah, I echo thanks for coming out on such a rainy day, very unusual for Los Angeles. The program today is going to be pretty simple. We're just going to have, we have with us two of the three editors of this new John Okada volume, and each of them will make a short presentation. We'll have a short discussion amongst the three of us afterwards, and then we'll throw it open for questions and answers with the audience, and then afterwards you'll have opportunity to get your book signed and meet the authors afterwards. So the first presentation is going to be by Frank Abe, as I said, one of the three co-editors of the volume, and who Frank authored a lengthy biography of Okada that's really the key piece in the volume. Of course, NoNo Boy has been such an important work in Japanese American history, but for all these years, we've known so little about the author of the book, and Frank's biography really is a huge contribution to the field in letting us know a little bit more of the story behind the author of this work. Frank is perhaps best known as a filmmaker for his seminal documentary Conscience and the Constitution about the draft resistors from the concentration camps, and it spawned a website, resistors.com, and a blog that Frank has kept up over the years. Many people don't know that he was an actor before, in perhaps the most memorable scene of Farewell to Manzanar, when he gets beat up as a JCL type figure. And he is, Frank is currently working on a literary anthology of literature produced in the camps and about the concentration camps. So with that, we'll bring up Frank Abe.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. What a great crowd. Thank you so much for coming. Speaking here at the National Museum feels like being at the epicenter of Japanese America. You know, this is really great. I'm from Seattle, and you guys react to rain like in Seattle we react to snow. You know, we stay inside when it snows, and you guys are like, oh, it's raining, better stay inside today. Okay, so I want to thank students from UCLA being here, from Keith Camacho's class and Kelly Fong's class. See you all Monday. Thanks for coming. I see these laptops. This is great. It's like giving a lecture in a lecture hall. Okay, good. So we're all here because we like NoNo Boy. NoNo Boy is the great Japanese American novel. I maintain it's the great Japanese American novel, the great Nisei novel that Larry Tajiri, Bill Hosokawa, James Omura all discussed who among us will write the great Nisei novel. And with the passage of time, I think now it's time to start asking that question: what is the great Nisei novel? NoNo Boy is certainly foundational, having sold 200,000 copies now over the past 40 years, and yet there's always been questions about the novel that have bedeviled readers and students over the years, as well as many unknowns around the author himself. So for those who are new to the book, the genius of NoNo Boy is that it starts after the end of World War II, and readers must work their way backwards in time to understand the story. And it opens like this. 2 weeks after his 25th birthday, Ichiro got off a bus at 2nd and Main in Seattle. He had been gone 4 years, 2 in camp and 2 in prison. Walking down the street that autumn morning with a small black suitcase, he felt like an intruder in a world to which he had no claim. It was just enough that he should feel this way, for of his own free will, he had stood before the judge and said that he would not go in the army. At the time, there was no other choice for him. That was when he was 23, a man of 23. Now, 2 years older, he was even more of a man. Christ, he thought to himself. Just a goddamn kid is all I was. Didn't know enough to wipe my own nose. What the hell am I doing here? What the hell have I done? Best thing I can do would be to kill some son of a bitch and head back to prison. So Ichiro sees an old friend approach in the street of Seattle, outside King Street Station, wearing an Eisenhower jacket. Eto Minato served in the army after the war, like a lot of Nisei guys did. Eto's all smiles. Hail, fellow, well met. Hey, welcome back to Seattle, Ichiro. How good to see you. When'd you get discharged? Where'd you serve? Yeah, it was tough out there in the battlefield, right? And Ichiro keeps dodging Eto's questions on page 2 until the friendliness is gone, and Eto realizes, NoNo Boy, huh? Ichiro wanted to say yes. He wanted to return the look of despising hatred and say simply yes, but it was too much to say. The walls had closed in and were crushing all the unspoken words back down into his stomach. He shook his head once, not wanting to evade the eyes, but finding it impossible to meet them. Rotten bastard. Shit on you. Eto coughed up a mouthful of sputum and rolled his words around it. Rotten, no good bastard. Surprisingly, Ichiro felt relieved. Eto's anger seemed to serve as a release to his own naked tensions. As he stooped to lift the suitcase, a wet wad splattered over his hand and dripped onto the black leather. I'll piss on you next time, said Eto vehemently. And that's just how the novel starts. Okay? It gets crazier after that. Ichiro's pain is so deeply felt that many readers assume that John Okada was a draft resistor too. And Okada was in fact a veteran like Eto. And today I'll show you how a Nisei veteran of World War II came to write a novel about a draft resistor. And the answer lies in the author's life growing up in the port city of Seattle. As we go through the story, we'll touch on a number of terms that have unfortunately entered our current events vocabulary in the past 2 years. The first is birthright citizenship. Here's the Okada family. From left, his mother, 3 brothers and baby sister. There's John on the right, next to his father, Yoshito. Racial laws barred the parents from naturalized U.S. citizenship, but the children, all born in Seattle, under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, John and his siblings automatically American citizens. Okada's managed hotels, including the Yakima Hotel in Chinatown. From there, a short walk to Bailey Gatzert School, where the principal organized a good American citizenship club for these children of immigrants. Now, John evidently didn't get the memo. That's him in the dark shirt, bolo tie, okay? Picture day. It was here he makes 2 lifelong friends, Roy Kumasaka and Frank Ashida. Their homeroom teacher taught them how to learn the structure of a language and diagram a sentence in English, a language that they'd picked up only by listening to the radio, because their parents spoke Japanese. Once public school ended at 3, the Nisei students would continue their schooling at the Japanese language school, the Kokugo Gakko in Seattle. John excelled with the rigor of Japanese school, just as he did at Broadway High School, where the student body was 1/4 Nisei. Shy, retiring, and industrious was how his Latin teacher described him. So the 18-year-old had just started at the University of Washington in fall of 1941 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. That night in Seattle, he saw the FBI arresting the fathers of his classmates, the ones who were community leaders, on the basis of some connection with our new enemy. In his bedroom at the Yakima Hotel, Okada tried to put down his thoughts for a class paper. But he said his mind was in a state of confusion and entanglement. He tried his hand instead with poetry. And in it, you can hear the earnest young voice of a college freshman who aspires to be a writer and only needs a subject. So here it is. I must be strong. I know now for what war I was born. Every child is born to see some struggle, but this conflict is yet the worst. For my dark features are those of the enemy, and my heart is buried deep in Occidental soil. People will say things, and people will do things. I know they will, and I must be strong. And the poem goes on from there. So this is the first surviving piece of creative writing we have by John Okada. And we've never known about it until now because it was published anonymously for 4 days after Pearl Harbor, okay? On the front page of the UW Daily. And it was only a passing reference in a government file that led me to go look for it. So why was it anonymous? Could have been modesty, but more likely, he wanted to protect his family from retaliation in the hysteria following Pearl Harbor. Last summer, another new term entered our vocabulary, family separation. We were all upset to see our government, separating children from their families seeking asylum on the southern border and putting them into detention camps where they are still being held as we speak here today. The Japanese-American experience was one of family separation in reverse. In our case, it was the fathers. Innocent men like Yoshito Okada, who were ripped from their children and wives. Mr. Okada escaped arrest on December 7th, but 2 months later, the FBI made a second sweep along the West Coast. Another Sunday morning, February 42, an FBI agent came to the Dorothy Yakima Hotel with a warrant for the arrest of Yoshito Okada. This was a family separation and would eventually inform the heart of the novel that John Okada will write. In March, a month later, Mr. Okada and 100 other Issei men were paraded out at King Street Station in Seattle, while on the other side of an iron fence, their families were crying out to them. The Seattle Times was there, tipped off there to get this photograph. So look on the right side of the photograph, upper right. You can see the arms of the wives and children reaching through the iron bars to scream out their goodbyes in Japanese and English. And you can see that's just what happened this year at the southern border. I should say last summer at the southern border. Somewhere in the darkness of the men on the left was Yoshito Okada. And somewhere behind the fence on the right had to be John Okada, his mother, and his siblings, because their hotel is only 2 blocks away from the train station. One man in this crowd later said, "For the first time it hit me that I might never see my wife and children again, ever." The men were put on a train for the Department of Justice internment camp at Fort Missoula, Montana. The Okadas were forced to sell their hotel business and were sent with 7,000 others from Seattle to the Family Detention Center at the Puyallup Fairgrounds, south of Seattle. Inside camp, their first priority is to reunite the family. And as the writer in the family, John Okada, types this urgent letter to one of their hakujin, their white boarders at the Yakima Hotel, who was like a second father to them. And John asks this boarder to vouch for their father. Give your honest opinion of him. Several men have been returned to their families in this manner. It may be that your letter will result in the happiest moment of our lives. Now this letter works because within 1 month their fathers are allowed to return. Mr. Okada is allowed to return to them in Puyallup. As you soon see, others are not so lucky. So Okadas are soon moved to the permanent camp, Minidoka, Idaho. Okada gets a job as a waiter in the Block 28 mess hall. But he spends only 3 weeks at Minidoka before he finds a way out. Okada is among the first students released from Minidoka to attend Scottsbluff Junior College in Nebraska, along with, in the middle, Roy Kumasaka, Frank Ishida on the right. Trivia, if you've read the novel, the first night when Ichigo is back from prison, his mother takes him to visit 2 families in Seattle. One's the Miss Kumasaka family, and the other's the Ishida family. Yeah. So once their year of school at Scottsbluff is up, and with JACL urging the draft for the Nisei out of camp, the 3 friends figure the only way for them to stick together is to enlist together for the Military Intelligence Service. And they're assigned to Camp Savage, Minnesota, to study as Japanese interpreters. Here they are in their uniforms. John builds on the Japanese he learned as a child, and he's ticketed for service in Guam with the Army Air Force's 8th Radio Squadron Mobile, nicknamed the Flying Eightball. So this is the Joint Communications Activity Center in Guam where the radio signals are being intercepted. And at first the Nisei in Guam were segregated away from the other white cryptographers. It was a combination of Army-Navy rivalry, but also lingering suspicion about the loyalty of the Nisei enlistees. So ironically, instead of being fenced in at the camp at Minidoka, John Okada and the Nisei translators found themselves fenced out of the radio listening post. But their commanding officers soon argued that if you put these Nisei guys into planes over the Japanese coastline, they could intercept and translate the enemy signals in real time. They needed 10 volunteers for an elite team to fly these dangerous missions over the Japanese coastline, and of course, all the Nisei men volunteered, and John's among the 10 who were selected. So as he describes in the preface to NoNo Boy, his job is to crawl into the belly of a modified B-24 bomber, put on a pair of earphones attached to a high-frequency set, and jot down air-to-ground messages from Japanese planes to Radio Shacks on the ground. The 10 volunteers earn the name the Flying Nisei. And John makes 24 of these dangerous missions over the coastline of Japan. He sends this photo back to his brother in camp. On the back, he writes, "Myself in Guam with plane I made missions on. B-24s look clumsy and ugly, but my respect for them will never die out. At least this one brought us all back safely, every time. From the plane I saw Mount Fuji in July 45 and the clustering of bombs on Tokyo during night raids." Well, the war ends. Okada serves briefly in Tokyo as a translator with occupation. But when he's discharged in 1946, he and the other Nisei, other MIS soldiers are told to keep their mouths shut about their secret operations. And John keeps his word. John returns to the UW, and with his GI Bill, he takes courses in creative writing and playwriting. His occupation service was not classified as a translator in Tokyo. That was not classified, it's not secret. So the first thing he does is write a one-act satire about it. When in Japan, the captain was not too sharp on diplomacy. And in a span of 4 months, Okada publishes this play in a new Seattle newspaper, along with 5 polished short stories that each written in different genres, like detective noir, comedy, or science fiction. The Northwest Times was a Nisei vernacular newspaper founded by journalist Bud Fouquet after the war. And there it is, the message. This story, What Can I Do?, features a character who prefigures both Ichiro and Kenji in NoNo Boy. But mostly, these are exercises in style and form, finished versions of stories he perhaps started in class. Okada had not yet found a story that mattered. That changes when a guy he knew from Broadway High School, Hajime Jim Akutsu, is released from federal prison. Jim Akutsu had resisted the draft at Minidoka. He was convicted of draft evasion, and like Ichiro, served 2 years at the federal penitentiary at McNeil Island, Washington. Jim gets released from McNeil, comes back to Seattle, and John and Jim go out to eat and drink at nightclubs like the Wame Club in Chinatown. And this is where the Nisei soldier begins to see a story in the Nisei draft resistor. You know, one reason John had this gag order on him not to disclose military secrets, but I think the other reason was that, John wrote about what he saw when he came back to Seattle. And what he saw was through Jim Akutsu, he saw his high school buddies, college buddies who served in the military fighting, spitting upon his buddies who refused the draft on principle. And over drinks, John discovers one more thing, that they share the same painful experience of family separation from their fathers. This group of men put the train to Minidoka, to Missoula, Montana. Jim's father was in that same group. He was arrested the same night as John's father. Both men had been fingered for subscribing to a Japanese language magazine, and this magazine's on an FBI watch list. But Jim's father was not as lucky. Mr. Akutsu was held at the Justice Department camp at Missoula for nearly 2 years, possibly due to an informant's report. He's finally released back to Minidoka after 2 years, and both father and son had changed so much that neither recognized the other. So over drinks at the Wame Club, at a table much like this one, John Okada takes notes as Hajime Jim Akutsu spills his story. And when it came time to write, 10 years later, came time to write his great Nisei novel, Okada draws his protagonist, not as a veteran, but as a draft resistor. In the first draft, the character is even named Hajime, because in their shared experience of family separation, John Okada could see himself. In the preface to NoNo Boy, Okada famously inserts his own persona as an Army enlisted man sitting in the belly of a B-24, like I said, but he's thinking about his friend who didn't volunteer for the Army because, and I quote, his father had been picked up in the second screening after Pearl Harbor. The enlisted man then goes on to think about how his friend refused the draft because a judge would not release his father from a Justice Department internment camp to rejoin his mother in a civilian WRA camp. And this friend, in the preface, pleads with the judge that his mother was, quote, an old woman, but misses the father enough to want to sleep with him. So as this preface transitions to chapter 1 in the novel, which I read to you, the point of view shifts from the enlisted man in the B-24 to that of the friend in prison, being released from prison. And in that cinematic dissolve, the author, who was a soldier, imagined himself in the shoes of his friend Akutsu, who was a resistor, and NoNo Boy can then be read as the author acting out the script from there. This is how the life of John Okada informs the novel he wrote. But the novel he published in 1957 did not sell. You know, Japanese America was not ready for it. If you go through the museum, you can see all the exhibits about the pain of resettlement and the silence that, after World War II. Just look at that cover. This captures all the pain of losing everything and being put behind barbed wire, everything that Japanese America wanted to forget after the war, not relive. So the novel was it disappeared. A few good reviews, disappeared. But John still had to support his family. And John Okada was always in search of a better paying job throughout his career. He was in Seattle Public Library, left for Detroit Public Library, brought the family to Fullerton, Southern California, where he got a job at Hughes Aircraft, writing the history of the Redstone Missile Project. He didn't like that job so much, so he left. And after he left, he wrote a scathing parody for a trade journal about waste in the defense contracting industry, in which he could not resist creating characters that parody his thesis, his story. Then he got perhaps his dream job, an account executive at a Los Angeles advertising agency. And it turns out John Okada was a chain-smoking 1960s Nisei madman who may have written ad copy for products like Tide detergent and Gleam toothpaste. When he was forced out in a merger, Okada even took a job as assistant director at the UCLA Research Library, where he stayed 6 months. Wasn't happy, he left again. So you all think of John Okada as a Seattle resident, but the family lived here in 2 places here in the Southland. Starting in 1958 in Fullerton, they lived in this ranch-style home on West Baker Street. And by 1964, they moved to South San Gabriel, which is now incorporated as the city of Rosemead. So this is the backyard where Okada built the white shed on the right so he could work on his second novel, a novel that would tell the hopes and dreams and sorrows of the Issei generation. He took his wife and children on vacations. This one is a place called Frontier Donuts. There's Dorothy, his wife, Matthew on the left, and Dorothea on the right. But overwork and his 2-pack-a-day cigarette habit took their toll, and John died of a heart attack in, that was, okay. This is, okay. Okada died of a heart attack in 1971 at the age of just 47. And in despair, his bereaved widow famously burned all of his letters and photographs, including this manuscript of his unfinished second novel about the Issei immigrants, contributing to making Okada a figure of some mystery. Fortunately, a new generation of Asian American writers from the Bay Area discovered Okada's novel just months after his death. The Combined Asian American Resources Project consciously was seeking out creative writing by Chinese and Japanese Americans before them. Jeff Chen, in fact, found a copy of NoNo Boy in a used bookshop in Berkeley, and CARP published a chapter in their groundbreaking anthology called Ai. And then they republished the entire novel, this version, out of their own pockets with this cover. So that story about the widow was made legendary, with the widow burning the manuscripts, was made legendary in Frank Chin's afterword to the paperback reprint called In Search of John Okada. And that essay, in fact, did more than anything else to set me on this quest in search of John Okada. I was immeasurably aided in that search by John's family. And we're honored today to have with us his son and daughter, Dorothea and Matthew Okada. So Dorothea, would you please, Matthew, please stand, just stand, please. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today. And now I want to introduce my collaborator, Greg Robinson.
Our next speaker will be Greg Robinson, the second of the three editors of the volume. Greg is a native New Yorker, but a professor at the University of Quebec at Montreal, and for the past 20 or so years, perhaps the most, I shouldn't say perhaps, probably certainly the most prolific historian of the Japanese American experience, best known for his books By Order of the President, a study of the role FDR played in the run-up to incarceration, an overview work called The Tragedy of Democracy, influential volume collection of the period after camp called After Camp, and many, many other volumes, edited volumes, articles, too numerous to mention, as well as forays into public history, including his column in the Nichibei Weekly. He contributed also to the Okada volume, something on the milieu of the literary world in Japanese America at the time, and also has written on the initial reaction to the book, initial reviews of the book. So with that, I'd like to bring up Greg Robinson.
Wow, lots of people here. Thanks for coming. It's a great honor for me to be here. I wanted to continue the story that Frank Abe started speaking. It was, as he said, in 1971, just weeks after John Okada's early death at age 47, that group of young Asian American writers that you saw photographed first rediscovered his novel NoNo Boy. It was these writers, including Frank Chin, Sean Wang, and Lawson Inada, who championed the work and eventually arranged publication of the Karp reprint edition. Meanwhile, there were others. The scholar Stephen Sumida began a long engagement with the Okada novel, and Frank Abe himself began a decades-long concentration on Okada, accumulating biographical details, interviewing family members, and tracking down lots of stuff on this unusual man and his extraordinary book. So now it's 47 years since Okada's death, and it gives us the opportunity to take a new look at this work and the man behind it. It was touching for me to be part of the team involved, and indeed to have so many of these original collaborators, including Lawson Inada and Sean Wang and Frank Abe, and indeed Frank Chin through the medium of his letters in his archives at UC Santa Barbara. My own pathway to this project took a rather different route. It came about through a sort of interesting set of events. In early 2007, I visited Seattle, where my dear friend Chizu Omori hosted me. She then had a dinner party where I could meet Frank Abe for the first time. During that dinner party, Frank Abe talked with great passion and interest about John Okada and NoNo Boy and his documentary film in production called, appropriately enough, In Search of NoNo Boy. Soon after, thanks in part to a recommendation by Chizu Omori, who was herself writes the column Rabbit Ramblings for the Nichibei, the intrepid editor of the Nichibei, Kenji Tegama, hired me to write a regular column, which we call The Great Unknown and the Unknown Great. One of the ways that I seek information for this column, and thus began a desperate search for material, is by looking at old Japanese American newspapers. One of the lucky things about Japanese Americans is that they're a very literary group. Except possibly for the Jews, no ethnic group in the United States before World War II was that prolific and diverse in its writing and production for the community. And indeed, even after the war and during the war, we retain all of these newspapers in English, luckily, because I don't read Japanese. And so I was lucky enough during that trip to Washington to check out the Seattle Public Library's collections of Japanese American newspapers, most notably a newspaper that I found, Frank showed you, the Northwest Times, this Nisei newspaper. They had hard copies of its collections from the 1950s, and I was delighted to discover this Nisei newspaper. It had columns by Gordon Hirabayashi, who had famously challenged Executive Order 9066. It had editorials by Bud Fouquet, the editor. It had all sorts of different information about life in Japanese America. So fast forward a year, I went back to the West Coast in the February of 2008. I had my first sabbatical from life in Montreal, and I wanted to get desperately out of Montreal winter. Not that Vancouver is exactly balmy in winter, but it's still much less cold, and I could do research for my book, A Tragedy of Democracy, about Japanese Canadians, because Vancouver is the great center of Japanese Canadians. And let's face it, I was desperate for good Japanese food, and Vancouver has some of the best in the world. So I spent a month in Vancouver looking through the Japanese Canadian newspapers. And during that time, I decided I'd go back down to Seattle, it wasn't very far, and go to the Day of Remembrance ceremony at the University of Washington, see my friends, and do some research. So when I went to University of Washington, I discovered that they had in their collections microfilm of the earlier years of the Northwest Times. So I found in those first volumes in January 1947 a one-act play and several short stories by John Okada, identified as a University of Washington student in the newspaper, the things that Frank showed you on the screen. So immediately when I got back to Vancouver, the first thing I did was to write to Frank, telling him that I had a sample, asking him whether he was already aware of these John Okada writings and whether they would be useful. And I got back immediately a response, and I don't know if I can do Frank's voice, but this is amazing. I'm going to talk to Okada's family about how they would like to proceed with reintroducing this material to the public. Okada scholars are going to go nuts. Sean Wong and Steve Sumida will go nuts when they hear this. Thank you for thinking of me at the library. I owe you a dinner next time you make a lightning visit to Seattle. Frank mentioned, in fact, that John Okada's brother Roy had remembered in an interview a one-act play performed on campus for which Roy had been drafted into playing a small part, but that he could remember very little of the play or the writing other than that. So fueled by Frank's interest, I immediately sent him the rest of the papers that I found of Okada in the Northwest Times, as well as another piece I'd found in my Canadian newspaper research. While doing research at University of British Columbia, I'd come across a newspaper from Toronto called the Continental Times. I don't know if you know anything about Japanese Canadian newspapers. There's sort of the Canadian equivalent of the Pacific Citizen, which is called the New Canadian. And then there was a little upstart publication called the Continental Times, which sprang up around 1950. It was a 4-page, mostly Japanese language newspaper. You can see it online through multiculturalcanada.ca. Anyway, I found a review of the original edition of NoNo Boy from 1957, and I sent it to Frank, and he wrote back, "Oh my God! I thought I would never see this, it being such to me an obscure paper. Thank you so much for this." He explained, "For 30 years, all most of us have ever seen is the blurb published in the back of the first Carp edition paperback of NoNo Boy with the file from the publishers. Whatever article it was excerpted from was lost in someone's file, so I had the attached excerpt, but never the full review." So I proceeded to write again in May to Frank about other discoveries I'd found about Okada. I said, "While looking at William Peterson's original 1966 article, Japanese American Success Story, I discovered a mention of John Okada. I had not absorbed before that NoNo Boy was referenced in the same article that people like to refer to as the foundation of the model minority thesis, that William Peterson had talked about how Japanese Americans had been so clever in being able to recover from the war and without helping aid from the government. So it occurred to me to see what else I could find on Okada, and I stumbled on further information, the wonders of 4-pay databases. I realized that these unknown works that I had turned up by and about Okada helped us deepen and reconfigure our understanding of the author and of the novel. And so the whole received story of Okada needed to be re-examined. For example, the idea that NoNo Boy had been blocked at its publication by conservatives and had become obscure because of boycotts by the JECL. So I turned to Frank. Since Frank was the great expert on Okada, while I had a larger specialization in Japanese American history, I decided that suggested that we could collaborate. I remember I took him to lunch and suggested that since he had all of this ability in areas that I had none, he would be a good collaborator. I also thought that since I was then involved in the last stages of doing an anthology on the Japanese American writer Mine Okubo, author of Citizen 13660, we might put together another anthology on Okada on the model of the Okubo anthology, which would include writings by the author plus a biography plus reminiscences and tributes to the author and other essays. And since both Okada's book and Okubo's book had been reprinted by University of Washington Press, I thought it would be a natural thing to turn to UW Press. However, the process proved considerably more involved than I thought it would be. First of all, both Frank and I were extremely busy. We each had demanding day jobs. In the years between 2009 and 2012, for example, I was the director of graduate studies and professor at my university, and I also published 3 full-length books, plus keeping up my column for the Nichibei. So I was lucky if I had 10 minutes to have a nervous breakdown. In any case, we also had almost no contact except for those few times that I went to Seattle. Frank had a demanding day job as well, but he and I continued to look through sources. For example, it was in John Okada's WRA file that he got through the government that he found that obscure reference to Okada's having written a poem, and that's where he tracked down that poem, I Must Be Strong, that he read to you a little bit. And he then found the University of Washington daily newspaper that had reprinted it. Luckily, Frank was living in Seattle and was able to do this legwork. Meanwhile, while I went to a conference at Stanford University, I found an online database about technical articles, and I found an obscure military procurement journal that had that satirical essay, The High Cost of Government Contracts. Similarly, in looking at Okada's CV from UCLA's library, which he got from Asian American Studies, Frank discovered in Okada's CV for his library job at UCLA that Okada had mentioned writing articles under a pseudonym. And so he had the brainstorm to have me check whether there were any articles written under that pseudonym, and that's when we found a second article from that same military journal. We hit pay dirt again. Frank, meanwhile, had the brainwave to look through Frank Chin's papers at UC Santa Barbara, and they contained Okada's original correspondence with his publisher, John Tuttle, and his description of his new book in 1957. We each came across reviews of the original edition of NoNo Boy in newspapers, some obscure from Asia and North America. We found lots of little tidbits online in Densho, in the Hoji Shimbun database, and which we sent each other and discussed interpretation in a kind of continuing seminar by correspondence. Another problem that came up was that while we worked well together and we shared many basic principles, we also had many disagreements over language and interpretation. Frank accused me of being soft on the JACL. We finally agreed that we were free to take our own positions in the parts written solo, but that the jointly produced pieces, we must be able to speak with one voice. So we did a lot of negotiation and a kind of seminar by correspondence in which we took time to explain our positions to each other and propose formulations that we could both live with. The next problem was that we had to stylize and analyze the newly discovered Okada writings and put them in context. Neither Frank nor I is a literary expert, and I didn't think that I could do it justice. Finally, I suggested my friend and longtime collaborator, Floyd Chung, professor of English at Smith College. It turned out, I had no idea, Floyd himself had a long history with Okada, and he had gone to do research at University of Washington on Okada's classwork and his professors, and he had done wonderful work in looking at Okada's transcripts with the grades removed. And he had studied, and so he not only wrote an amazing essay on Okada's youthful stories and his play, but his overall suggestions were so brilliant that Frank and I agreed that Floyd should join us as a co-editor. The next problem was that the biographical information on John Okada that Frank Abe had uncovered in his interviews and the preparations for his documentary film was so much more abundant that we couldn't contain it in just one introduction. Yet, despite Frank's long search for John Okada the person, he still wanted to focus more on his life and times, and particularly on the story of Japanese communities in Seattle, where he wanted to shed further light on the places mentioned in the book in the physical community. And I see that I wrote, when we were planning the prospectus, "Dear Frank, I think that while the location of the novel is clearly Seattle, and your tour of the sites of the novel is quite interesting, the place of NoNo Boy is at least as much in the heart of Japanese America as it is in Seattle or any other particular area. The post-war years remain a black hole in Japanese American history, and the story of the damage the camps wrought on the Nisei is certainly one that needs to be told. So I think we need to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think that our search for Okada himself and understanding the author's own twisted history remains a part of our story, and an important one. The final problem that we faced, even after we'd gotten all of our biographical information together, solicited the contributions from our contributors, and put together a volume, is that the word count requirements with the publisher were so stringent that we had to cut the manuscript by something like a third to 40%. Poor Steve Sumida had to suffer death by 1,000 cuts in his essay, and Frank Abe was forced to jettison a good part of his biography. I deeply felt the loss of my own contributions. I had written a major essay on the history of internment camp literature that situated Okada's achievement, and I had added excerpts from the original reviews which revealed how people viewed Okada and themselves back in 1957. However, in the end, I had to take my major piece and make it into a minor piece. I cut about half of it. Luckily, I was able to repurpose the rest to another essay in another volume. And I cut out the piece that I wrote on the original reviews. Luckily, the Japanese American National Museum allowed me to put it in as one of my Discover Nikkei columns for their blog. So once that was imagined and reimagined, we were able to publish. I think that what we've been able to accomplish is to reopen the story of John Okada, make the author less mysterious, and give him the kind of attention that he surely would have been able to receive if he had survived, even as his work has survived. Thank you for listening.
You know, the first thing I wanted to ask both of you, I think you alluded to but didn't really talk about, and it struck me because of, I think, the essay by, I believe, Sean Wong in the book about how the impact of reading the book for the first time. And I wondered if both of you could talk about your reaction or how you first encountered the book and what your reaction was.
I was lucky to fall into the Asian American Theater Workshop in San Francisco, 1973, and meeting Frank Chin, Lawson, and these guys for the first time. And they were already in the process of recovering Asian American, Japanese American, Chinese American literature for IE. And NoNo Boy Okada was on the, basically in the air at the time. And I was lucky. My history goes back to this incident where Frank's wife Kathleen gave me the cassette tape that Frank and Sean and Jeff and Lawson had interviewed Dorothy Okada in Pasadena in 1971 and January 72, and I got paid like $20 to transcribe this tape of Dorothy Okada telling them about John and his life, and that was my introduction to NoNo Boy, I think even before I read the novel. And that her voice stayed in my head for 40 years. I can still hear it. And it gives me that feel for what life with John was like. The second bit of trivia is that when they published the cover for NoNo Boy, Carp did, this photograph, the drawing by Bobo Nadero on the cover is actually based on a photograph of myself in the Asian American Theater Workshop in 1975, production called Honey Bucket. And it has my cheekbones on it, but it's a picture of me that Bob used to base his cover design. and I actually used the Ichiro's internal monologues, which I thought were great. I thought they could be good stage dialogue. And I used them as audition pieces in my acting career. Ichiro's internal monologue with his mother. Yes, no, I'm not your son. I'm not Japanese. I'm not American. That one. And it was I think with some limited success, but really I think it was the voice in the novel is so authentic and raw and original that what I read to you, I really wanted to read you the first page because it gives you the feel for the vernacular that John Okada captured in the pages of NoNo Boy, and I hope that it encourages you to read the whole novel, because it is a vision of Japanese America that we did not have back in the 70s and 80s, and I think even still today. I mean, it is we get a lot of, I shouldn't say this, we a lot of cliche and stereotype in storytelling around the Japanese American experience. And John was there, he lived it, and he captured it accurately. And that to me is the fascination with the novel.
Did you first see it in this edition, or did you see?
Well, I was in San Francisco. I was in Kinokuniya Books in the Peace Plaza, San Francisco, and I saw the original Tuttle hardcover edition that I showed you on the screen with the cover. And I'll confess that when I looked at the dust jacket and it said, "This is the story of Ichiro, a draft resistor," and his friend Kenji, a one-legged, a veteran who lost a leg in the war. And I thought, oh, that doesn't sound right. That sounds unpleasant. I put it down. I had a first edition copy of NoNo Boy in my hands, and I put it down. I didn't have any money, too, but I put it. It was $3.95. It was just $4, and I wound up paying $40 for it 10 years later, and it's like $200 now. But I put it down because it doesn't seem very pleasant, that was I think a lot of people in the 50s had the same reaction. Now, I want to say real quickly that people have said that JCL had a role in suppressing NoNo Boy in the 50s, but in fact, the evidence shows that Bill Hosokawa, who was the voice of JCL in Pacific Citizen George from the Frying Pan, Bill Hosokawa wrote a review of NoNo Boy at the time, praised, here's a writer of promise who could in fact be the one who, he holds promise. And he didn't say NoNo Boy is a great novel. He said John Okada has the promise of being a great writer, and perhaps someday will write the great Nisei novel. Well, I maintain he did. Yeah.
Well, actually, one of the things that surprised me most about that Bill Hosokawa column and the William Peterson reference to Okada is that they were praising NoNo Boy as a conservative novel, as an anti-radical novel, that Ichiro is actually self-hating because he's a loser, because he didn't volunteer for the army or go into serve in the 442nd. He missed the great Japanese-American wartime experience, and so it's actually, in this view, an anti-radical novel. It's looking down on Ichiro because he didn't make the cut. And I think it's a sample of how broadly written and how rich Okada's novel is, that you can actually do these kind of very various interpretations. I mean, I don't think that's a correct interpretation given what Okada wrote about it himself. We find in his letters to Tuttle that he said that Ichiro may be guilty, but it's the US government that is the most guilty.
And then while you're on this, can you talk a little bit about what you found about some of the contemporaneous reviews beyond Hosokawa?
Right. The first place that NoNo Boy was reviewed was in the English language press in Japan. I mean, it may have been reviewed in the Japanese language press in Japan. I don't know. I don't read Japanese. So, but since it was published by a publisher and it was actually printed in Japan, the books were available in Japan and in Asia before they were available in North America. The Japanese-based English language press was very mixed on it. Some people complained that it was not good English. Some people said that what is the problem? That is, there's a Frenchman who had been a veteran of the Algerian, or rather the Indochina War, and he said, of course, if you oppress a person, he's not going to come into the army willingly. It's only in the United States case that this question comes up with the question of assimilation. One of the nicest reviews was one in the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, where they talked about the promise of it being part of a wave of literature by Asian Americans. One reviewer, who may well have been Kenneth Yasuda from Internal Evidence Among Tuttle, talked about it being, again, the avant-garde of perhaps more to come.
And then one thing I wanted to also do is that you talked, you gave a kind of overview of the biographical piece that you wrote, and Greg talked about his piece. You referenced Floyd's piece on the other writings in the book. Can you talk about some of the other pieces in the Okada book? And I want to acknowledge Martha too as one of the contributors to the volume.
She contributed a chapter to this.
Are there? I don't know if there are others here. I don't think so.
Present. I mean, we did commission Steve Sumida. Of course, we couldn't do a volume of NoNo Boy without Steve Sumida, who has taught NoNo Boy from the very beginning, since the 70s, at the University of Washington. Just retired from the UW, and Steve, I think, is a premier Okada scholar, and so we worked on his piece. And on first review, the editors or the review committee at UW Press wanted more of the scholarship included. So they asked for a review of, and I should mention, NoNo Boy has sparked a cottage industry in graduate student theses and dissertations. And there are a number of published critical studies of John Okada and NoNo Boy. And you do a Lexis search, you'll find dozens and scores of these in English and Japanese and German, and all these students across the world doing dissertations on John Okada and Japanese American literature. And so Jeff Yamashita, formerly of Bay Area, did a nice survey for us, capturing the first and second generation of Okada scholarship, which is in our book as well. And I think that the biography we did and the short stories, inclusion of all of his known writings opens up new avenues for all you poor undergraduate and graduate students to follow to follow these threads of new Okada writing to work with for your future dissertations. Sorry.
Do we know that these are all the Okada pieces?
Boy, we included every scrap of writing, letters, scribblings on the back of a photograph of his brother is in the book, every single word. And thanks to Dorothea and Matthew for helping us locate things. So if there's more, I'd love to post it on my blog, because it's because of the mystery around burning of his letters and photographs by his widow, there was this mystery, this mystique around In Search of John Okada, right? That's the name of Frank's essay. And so, we put everything in. And if more surfaces, I'm happy to share it online.
What was there anything particularly surprising in the research that either of you did?
Okay.
Well, I think first, just the fact that there were these other stories and that they had been in the Nisei press. Again, part of the mystique of Okada is that he had been renounced by the Nisei press. That Tuttle publisher, in fact, said the very market that we went for was the Japanese American market, and they were the ones who were the least responsive. So the fact that John Okada had been able to find his voice in working for a Nisei newspaper in the beginning of the post-war period was rather surprising to me. I think also the fact that he worked in so many different kinds of media, in poetry, in satirical essays, in short stories. But I think the most remarkable thing that it shows about Okada, just beyond NoNo Boy, is the fact that he had this extraordinary empathy. He could put himself in the place of a NoNo Boy. Even he, as an Army veteran, could. He was a storyteller. So the early short stories that we find, none of them is really autobiographical. They're all telling stories of other people.
I think in terms of John's life, just discovering the many careers he had, and what was most surprising personally to me, we knew about his technical writing and about his librarianship, but to discover that he actually worked for 3 Los Angeles advertising agencies later in his life was a complete surprise to me. But it was in his Dr. Margie Lee at UCLA helped us find exhume his resume that he sent to UCLA for the research library job in the '67 or so, and in it he detailed all the products that he had written he had been a account executive for all these different, Decca records and 8-track players and a lot of defense industry work, of course. He had been an advertising executive. And Dorothy, in the interview, said that she thought that John had thought his ideal job would be in advertising. And this is like after graduating college, after the war. He wanted to be in advertising, which is very interesting because his voice is so polished, it's so public, and he knows his audience. He can reach people through his words. But she said, but at that time in advertising, the Japanese were out, and so he could never. She felt, and I think Dorothea told me that she never really felt that John found the job that he really wanted.
But that is in itself a paradox. That you read the NoNo Boy, it's the voice of anger, it's the voice of community disintegration and people who, there's a glimmer of hope at the end, but these are really people who are down and out. And you discover that John Okada himself lived, on the surface, a rather normal life.
Well, he almost embodies, at the surface, almost this model minority stereotype.
Yes.
I call him a Nisei everyman.
Yeah.
He worked hard, study hard, work hard, raise a family. And have a day job. He had a day job, wrote at night, but a typical Nisei father, who also, of course, didn't talk to his children too, like all Nisei fathers. Yeah.
What do we know about the lost manuscript? If anything.
Okay. So the lost manuscript, we don't know the title, but in looking for a publisher, John Okada approached Dorothy says a half dozen. I think it's probably scores of New York publishers.
How long had he been working on that? Do you know?
Yes, he was working on NoNo Boy as early as Columbia University in 1949. The photograph on the cover of the book is taken at Columbia University, his room, his apartment, when he was in 1949. And a fellow said that John Okada was writing sketches for the novel at that time. But I think really the writing for the novel took place when he moved the family to Detroit and away from Seattle, away from his fishing buddies and poker buddies. He could work harder to reinvent his hometown of Seattle on the page. He had to work harder to imagine and use his words to recreate King Street Station, the Maynard Alley, the Wame Club, and the feel of the times, and also had no distractions because Matthew's playing the violin and home, and he was raising his family. So he wrote a query letter to Charles Tuttle. His last chance was a publisher in Japan, Rutland, Vermont in Japan. Charles Tuttle, who was also a serviceman who had served in the occupation. And even in the query letter, he says, I have this novel called a novel. He didn't have a name for it yet. And he's in the second paragraph, he says, and I'm also working on a second novel. I'm now at work on a second, which will have for its protagonist an immigrant Issei rather than a Nisei. When completed, I hope that it will, to some degree, faithfully describe the experiences of the immigrant Japanese in the U.S. This is a story which has never been told in fiction, and only in fiction can the hopes and fears and joys and sorrows of people be adequately recorded. I feel an urgency to write of the Japanese in the U.S., for the Issei are rapidly vanishing, and I should regret it if their chapter in American history should die with them. So that was he had two novels, basically. Frank Chin asked Dorothy, okay, so what do you remember the novel? All she could remember was two things. The opening in which an Issei man jumped ship, presumably Elliott Bay in Seattle. Today we'd call them undocumented illegal immigrants. So in Seattle, folklore has it that the ship jumpers in Seattle would jump ship, Elliott Bay, cold water, advised to look for the tallest building in town, which was at the time Smith Tower, the tallest building west of Chicago. Find Smith Tower and keep walking that direction to reach Seattle's Japantown. So here's what Dorothy had to say. Okay. Well, it was a very rough draft. I think it started out by Issei jumping overboard and swimming, and then went to the shore, and then he walked and walked until he saw that soy sauce barrel? So that's the way you can identify that there was Japanese living, when you see that soy sauce. And then they would go in and ask for help. That's a true story. So he started out with that. and one more scene Dorothy remembers is one of a U.S. Immigration inspectors with the Japanese women arriving, lifting up the kimonos of the Japanese women to see whether they were trying to enter the country while pregnant, which would be the 1900s version of anchor babies. So that's what we know of the Issei novel.
And then, can you just talk about what happened?
Oh, when John passed of a heart attack in February of '71, the family, Dorothy had to downsize. The kids were, you guys were out of the house, right? You were about USC and back east to college, right? So the empty nest, and Dorothy wanted to downsize. So they had this big ranch house, I mean, this kind of almost like farm in Rosemead. And she had downsized, so she was cleaning house. And she wanted to, just toss everything. And she did tell Frank Chin and Lawson that she burned, his letters, photographs, and the unfinished manuscript, because she said it was a combination of grief and despair, that she was mad at John for not taking her with him, passing before him. And then that she was mad at him for that, but also that I have John in my heart, she said. I have John in my heart, so I don't need these papers, these pictures, I have them in my heart, and that's all that really matters. So she kept the contract for NoNo Boy, she kept his military discharge paper, because these are official documents, right? So she kept the official documents, but she, look at that, she tossed everything else, burned it.
But we don't know how far he got on that second novel, and we also don't know how long it had been since he had stopped work on the second novel.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Matthew was just telling us that he recalls seeing a yellow legal pad with an outline for the novel, for the characters in it, when he was a kid, and but we don't know exactly what there was. He didn't have backup copies, didn't mail a draft to a friend, but he did tell his friends back in Seattle that he was working on the great American novel. He was ambitious. He had a vision. He was going to write the great American novel.
For this section, we just have a few more minutes. So I just wanted to kind of end with asking both of you, maybe starting with Greg, how would you summarize the legacy of NoNo Boy?
I think NoNo Boy is the great forerunner. It's sort of the urtext of Japanese-American post-redress, or redress and post-redress history. It is the first book by a Japanese-American to be published that takes up the question of the camps and talks about the damage that the camps wrought. And as actually Brian himself wrote in a very piquant review of NoNo Boy for Densho, that it's a historical artifact because it's been matched since, and some of the novelty has probably worn out for later generations. But that in itself, actually, I would say, gives us a chance to look at exactly what's in it from a more historically neutral point of view.
Legacy of NoNo Boy, Greg and I disagree about this, but it's very simple. NoNo Boy is the great Nisei novel. It's the great Japanese-American novel, period.
Yeah, I like Gene Oishi's Foxdrum Bebop, but I recognize the achievement of NoNo Boy, and there are a lot of extraordinary aspects to NoNo Boy that you wouldn't expect that somebody writing in the 1950s would have gotten into. Questions about black Americans, anti-Semitism, the kind of vernacular language that Okada brings in. And that's one of the nice things about the stories and the play, is that you get to see him writing in all different registers, so you know that he was actually an expert craftsman. He wasn't writing in NoNo Boy in that style because he didn't know any way to write proper English. It was very conscious and very deliberate. 200,000
copies. People want to do movies of NoNo Boy. Scores of dissertations. How many for Foxdrum Bebop? I'm sorry. Case closed. I rest my case.
I like Foxdrum Bebop.
Oh no.
Well.
Okay. Well,
But that's
no
neither here nor there.
Yeah.
I think at this point we're going to go to questions from the audience, and
Yes.
If you can raise your hand, and then we will bring the mic to you.
Hi, Frank. I think it's fascinating that John Okada used, was it Akutsu, for the Ichiro character. Did you know Akutsu, and how faithful is the Akutsu and Ichiro character?
Okay, two questions. Jim, very well known in the Seattle community, outspoken as a resistor. So I don't recall when I first met him, but he was very accessible, very friendly, very talkative, very discursive. It was kind of hard to actually listen to him sometimes because he would just ramble on. But as for accuracy, I think that John Okada took the outlines of Jim's experience. John's family, when I started asking the questions, they wanted to be sure I pointed out that the mother character was nothing like the mother in the novel. I mean, that was very important to them for me to understand and acknowledge that John Okada's mother, he loved her, not estranged from her. Their mother wasn't delusional. So in the novel, Ichiro's mother believes that the Japan won the war. They didn't lose. The ships were coming from Japan to rescue the true believers of the Kachigumi, the victory faction, to rescue them and take them back to Japan. Jim Akutsu's mother actually did subscribe to Kachigumi, the Shindo Renmei cult in Brazil. So there was a factual basis for this delusion that Okada writes about in NoNo Boy, the novel. And I think that helps high school students who don't understand that part of the novel. It's true, it's not, it was factual. And that's Jim's story. But I think that Mark Nakagawa is right in saying that the real draft resistors, Kutsu, Frank Emi, Tako Shizaki, they look at NoNo Boy, and here's Yoshi Kuramiya too, look at the character and say, he is so ambivalent, so confused, and lost that I really don't like that character. That's not me, And Kutsu, Frank Emi would say, if someone spat on me, if a veteran spat on me, I just haul back and punch him, knock him down, And Kutsu was a fighter too. So that I think I tried to show that John Okada was projecting himself into the shoes of a draft resistor. If he had, had his father taken away for 2 years and had all the homes taken away, and if he had been in prison for 2 years, I wonder if John would have resisted the draft. And this is how John felt. He would have felt if he had been a draft resistor. He didn't actually make that choice himself, and it's all there. Yeah.
So this actually raises a question that just frustrates me to no end about NoNo Boy, because it's, unlike Brian, Mr. Skeptical. When I first came across this book, I absolutely loved it because I love stories of resistance and defiance, but the title is so misleading, right? I mean, this is something that everybody deals with, and it leads to complete misunderstandings of who the draft resistors are and who NoNo Boys are, and also just sort of sorry, I just saw somebody that I haven't seen in a while. Just that, and also there's sort of the no yes. There's so many valences to these issues. What do you know why he titled it? No, is this part of the mystery, or is there an answer to this?
It's part of the mystery. Thank you for your question. And we had to address this right at the top in the introduction. John Okada did a little bit of a disservice to the Nisei draft resistors because the conflation of hi Gerald, the conflation of the NoNo Boys and the draft resistors is something that I think started with the publication of NoNo Boy. NoNo Boys and draft resistors are two distinct groups, okay? In 1943, all the men and women over 18 were given a questionnaire. 2 questions on this questionnaire asked, are you willing to serve in the armed forces and willing to forswear allegiance to Japan? And those who answered no to those 2 questions, whether because they believed it, or they really felt no, or because they were protesting, they were segregated from the others and sent to the Tule Lake Segregation Center in Northern California, Oregon border. And they were the NoNo Boys, and the so-called NoNo Boys, or NoNo people. as Martha would say. The draft resistors are those who, a year later, in 1944 January, after Mike Basoka and JCL urged the Nisei, the reinstitution of the draft for the Nisei in the camps, who protested by refusing the draft to get a test case into court to protest not military service, but the draft resistance, as I showed my film, Conscience Constitution, was a protest against incarceration. They were protesting eviction and incarceration 2 years after the fact because the breaking the law, the draft law, was the only way that Tako Shizaki could get a case into court to bring to light the constitutional violations of camp. Jimokutsu was a draft resistor. Ichiro Yamada in the novel, as I read to you, 2 years in camp, 2 years in prison. He was a draft resistor. There's no fancy name for them. They're just draft resistors, or the Fair Play Committee, Heart Mountain. So by calling the novel NoNo Boy, it conflates the two groups, and it done irreparable confusion to even the writer of the introduction to our book, Ruth Ezeki. I got to fix this in her introduction, her preface. It confuses the two issues.
One thing it's important to say is that I've had this dialogue with Frank all the time we've been writing this book, because when he's examined Okada's correspondence with Charles Tuttle, it's that Frank, this is his first book. It's amazing that he's writing his first book now, and it's such a strong piece, but so many things about authors dealing with publishers he didn't know about. And so I was the one who was assigned to negotiate the contract. I was the one who was also talked, for example, his contract with Tuttle gave Tuttle first refusal on another book, and so Frank assumed that meant that they were going to publish the second novel, and I said, no, it's a standard clause in contracts. Very often the publisher decides on the title. And since John Okada did not propose a title for the novel in his pitch letter to Tuttle, it's very probable, not certain, but very probable that it's Tuttle's initiative to call it NoNo Boy.
That's a very good point, Greg, because I didn't make the connection in the book. But the first reference to NoNo Boy is in the contract that Charles Tuttle gave to John Okada. It's the first mention historically of the title NoNo Boy. The term did exist before that. I mean, Roger Daniels had us searching for the origins of the term. But it's a very good question. And I personally thought that John, if John gave the title, it was because it was catchy. And that, see, now remember, Okada was not in camp. He was not there for the registration. He was not there for the draft. He was in Guam, or Japan. So he got all this information secondhand from Jimokutsu over drinks at the Wame Club, and they were drunk. And he's taking notes, and his drinks are sloshing around. He's just drinking, and so I think he got it mixed up. Yeah, but also I like the thing that Tuttle gave him the title. Yeah.
I'll be very nice.
Here comes trouble.
I just want to make a comment about the title NoNo, because I've had debates about this with William Horry, who was another brilliant Nisei. And the first edition has NoNo written all across the pages. And one of the things he thought, maybe because he felt that these men were no-nos, that they're taboo, that, not referring to the loyalty questionnaire, but, that's a no-no. These are no-no people. And so William thought perhaps that's what it was referencing. I just want to share that my first reaction to reading this book was I hated it. I didn't know anything about the camps. At that point, my father had not talked about being in camp and being a protester in camp. And my reaction was I had no interest in learning more about the camps. I thought the character Ichiro was a very weak character, and practically I wouldn't care if he had killed himself. I think he does do a disservice, as Frank Abe had mentioned, that some of the other draft resistors that I know anecdotally, and the Tui Lake NoNo people either have no interest in reading this book, or if they read it, they did not like the book. And so there's been kind of a debate within our circle about, the relevance of this book. And even with the mother character, I think he does a very big disservice, because the only character in the book that has any feelings toward Japan is Crazy. And so, I have feelings for Japan. I'm third generation. My relatives are in Japan. I can speak conversational Japanese. So does that make me crazy and disloyal? And there's so much self-hatred in this book also, to, forget your language. It's basically the government propaganda line that John Okada keeps alive. I think that does much more damage to, being an Asian American. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Martha. And despite this, Martha contributed a chapter to our anthology. So thank you, Martha, for your chapter.
Thank you for including me and not kicking me off.
We were tempted, but
One of the interesting things is comparing Okada's vision of the draft resistors with the vision in James Edmonston's Home Again, which was published right around the same time in 1955. Edmonston, who was a WRA staffer and later turned screenwriter, wrote this novel, which is an epic story of Japanese Americans over several generations. In the novel, the family is in camp, and one of the sons becomes a draft resistor. And he's portrayed rather positively as being misguided, certainly, but fundamentally sincere and calling attention to a real problem, whereas the person who inspires him or seduces him into being a draft resistor is quite a negative character. Kyoshi Okamoto character who's portrayed as being pro-Japanese and being hypocritical and calling for his rights as a U.S. citizen. But I think the thing about Okada's NoNo Boy is that it was the limit of what he could get away with. It's funny, we compare the Hollywood production code, which had in which discussion of homosexuality was forbidden. So when the code first gets challenged or starts to adapt in the 1960s, there are all sorts of negative portrayals of homosexuality, whether in the film The Children's Hour or in the Detective with Frank Sinatra or various other things. And it's gay people themselves who are putting on these productions. They realize that having negative portrayals of homosexuality is the only way they can get any image of homosexuality on the screen, and they prefer that to having nothing.
Martha did mention the idea of self-hatred in the character of Ichiro Yamada, and I invite the students who will read the novel to examine the question of whether it's self-hate or is it simply an author, using the device of a character who's torn, asking himself questions internally, and through the questions he asks himself, you generate conflict, you generate interest, emotion, and I think that was necessary for him to do that to. Create not just a one-dimensional or two-dimensional character, but a three-dimensional character who's raising these questions in his own mind, spinning internal monologues that draw out the tensions and the questions that the Nisei faced at the time.
So, Greg, JCL's been mentioned a few times today, and you mentioned there was a boycott of the book by the JCL. Can you tell us more about what that was about? It seems like it probably affected the sales in the Japanese American community.
No, what I said is that there's the legend by Frank Chin and others that there was a JCL boycott, and that's the reason that the novel didn't sell. The reason that the novel didn't sell, it's certainly true that Tuttle said that Japanese Americans were the target audience and they weren't particularly interested in the novel. But my suggestion is that the novel was not known to most Japanese Americans because it wasn't reviewed in the Japanese American press. And the reason it wasn't reviewed in the Japanese American press was not because there was a boycott by the JCL, but simply because the Japanese American press at that time didn't review any books. It didn't review Edmonston's book, it didn't review Vanya Oak's book, it didn't review Sanai Kawaguchi's children's books. It didn't, after the war, and with McCarthyism especially, the literary sections, the book reviews, the poems, the stories that had been a main feature of pre-war Japanese American literature were wiped out. The Pacific Citizen and Crossroads published a few sketches, including some by Hiroshi Kashiwagi in their Christmas issues. But by and large, there were the weekly columns that had featured literature, and thus the discussion of literature within the community was disintegrated, was devastated. So the reason that I call my essay about Okada in the book A Seed in a Devastated Landscape is that he was starting to write and publish at a time when there was no literature in the community.
Next project, Floyd Chung and I collaborated, are working on an anthology of the literature of Japanese American incarceration. And one thing we're looking for is works written by Issei and Nisei in camp, both in English and Japanese, to be included in our anthology. So if anyone's aware of any pieces that have not been collected or surfaced until now, please let me know, because we're looking for new pieces to include in this anthology. I'm very interested in Tule Lake, the Tasaku literary magazine. A lot of work there written by Kibe Nisei and Issei in Japanese that we're hoping to get translated. Some fine work in there, on a par, I think, with Okada's work. But it's in Japanese, so no one's ever studied it, read it, and so on. But I think for this anthology for Penguin Classics in the fall of 2020, we want to have this new terrain to discover.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to Greg and to Frank. And we'll have time to do some signing and meeting of the authors, right?